Free agent quarterback Derek Carr visited the Jets over the weekend. By all accounts, it was a positive and constructive visit, but what are the chances the Jets sign the former Raiders quarterback? We'll talk about it today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, February 21st, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please, a 5-star review helps the channel out tremendously. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, over the weekend, all eyes were on Derek Carr. The former Raiders quarterback had a free agent visit with the Jets. The Jets are the second team he's visited. Back when he was under contract with the Raiders, he actually visited the New Orleans Saints. This was a point where the Raiders and Saints were trying to work out a trade, and they actually agreed to terms on a trade, but it was contingent on Carr waiving his no-trade clause, which was something he was unwilling to do for pretty logical reasons. Because he was cut, now he has an opportunity to speak with everybody who's interested, not just one team, so he can gauge what the best offer is out there for him. Based on reports, however, we now know that, at least if these reports are accurate, that the Jets and the Saints were the only two teams that called the Raiders to inquire about a potential trade for Carr. So those seem to be the two leaders in the clubhouse right now. I have to tell you, I am a little surprised. I had commented about this over the last couple of weeks, how it surprised me that there was not a lot of buzz about Derek Carr coming to the New York Jets. And that could be a sign of one of two things. It could be a sign that, one, that the Jets were more focused on Aaron Rodgers, that Carr was really not in their plans, or two, it could just be that they were being quiet about their intentions, and it certainly now seems to be the latter. The Jets, of course, have brought Carr in for a visit, so clearly there's interest, and by all accounts, this was a very good visit. Jeff Darlington of ESPN stated on Monday, "I'm told it was a very positive meeting, that the Jets really believe that Derek Carr is the type of quarterback that can lead them to a potential championship." And, if you were following social media over the weekend, you saw a picture that may or may not be true of a meal at a restaurant in New Jersey that seemed to have Derek Carr. It seemed to have Nathaniel Hackett, maybe Robert Saleh, maybe Todd Downing. Who knows whether that's true or not? I'm not here to tell you to verify the authenticity of pictures that appear on social media about people dining out at restaurants, but pretty much from all corners, it sounds like this was a positive meeting. It sounds like the Jets would be willing to make Carr an offer, but there's a question right now. And that's because the situation with Carr is a bit unusual, and it could have an expedited time frame. Most players who are going to become free agents are not free agents yet. Guys like Lamar Jackson who have expiring contracts. Yes, they're going to be free agents unless they're franchised, but they're not technically free agents until the new league year begins in the middle of March, because their contract technically runs through the end of the 2022 league year. And even though the season's over, even though we're past the Super Bowl, it is still technically 2022 in the NFL. New Year's Day in the NFL doesn't come until the middle of March, and that's when those contracts expire. That's when those players are free to sign with a new team. Carr doesn't have a contract because he was cut, so he could sign today. He could sign tomorrow. He can sign whenever he wants. He's a free agent. He's not a free agent to be like a Lamar Jackson is, assuming Jackson doesn't get tagged, which may happen, but that's another story. Carr's a free agent right now. So this could play out very quickly. And the Jets may have to make a decision because, as we know, and this one's I feel pretty confident in saying, the Jets are also interested in Aaron Rodgers. And based on what we know, it seems like Rodgers would be their number one choice. Here's the thing. We don't know what the time frame is going to be for Aaron Rodgers. We do know that there's a lot of complexity that would have to be worked out in any trade. We're talking about compensation the Packers would receive, talking about assurances Rodgers would give you, talking about his contract. Now, the Jets have gotten to work talking with Green Bay and trying to at least figure out what the compensation would be, but that's only step one of a process that's going to be very complicated. And we don't know what's going to happen with Rodgers. I mean, I think the last 2 to 3 years have shown us that trying to predict what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers is just a silly thing to do, because nobody, even Aaron Rodgers, I don't think knows what he's going to do from 1 minute to the next. So we don't really know what the time frame is for Rodgers. Meanwhile, Carr could move very quickly. And this is what makes it tricky, because I think Carr is probably the Jets' second choice. Now, he's my first choice, but I think, to be fair, he's probably the Jets' second choice right now. So that leaves you with the dilemma. Do you act on Carr now and take yourself out of the Rodgers game entirely? Or do you wait on Carr, and knowing that you're probably going to lose him if you wait on him, and then you put all your eggs in the Aaron Rodgers basket? Because after Rodgers, there's a huge drop-off. The next level is probably like the Jimmy Garoppolo, Ryan Tannehill, maybe you could throw Jacoby Brissett in there. That's a pretty big drop-off. And you're putting all your eggs in Rodgers' basket. And again, Rodgers, I'll use the word, has been unpredictable the last couple of years. He's not exactly been the model of reliability when we're talking about the decisions about where he's going to play. So it's a tricky spot for the Jets. Now, I've stated this many times, and I'll state it again because I think it should be stated again. Based on the price, I just don't see Rodgers being a good option for the Jets. I think the Jets are going to be interested in Rodgers. I think he is their number one choice. I think when you're talking contract, when you're talking the fact you have to trade something to get him, potentially a couple of early picks for Rodgers. Maybe less, maybe a little bit more. But you're going to have to give something up trade-wise for Rodgers in the way you won't with Carr. And the other aspect of this, beyond, and I've talked salary, I've talked compensation, Rodgers is approaching 40, so how many more years can you expect him to play? It seems to me like this would be, unless the terms of compensation were redone radically, it seemed to me Rodgers would be kind of a short-sighted move for the Jets. And it's not that Derek Carr is as good as Aaron Rodgers. It's not that he's going to the Hall of Fame the way Aaron Rodgers is. If you could have peak Aaron Rodgers or peak Derek Carr, there's not really any debate there. I'm not saying that, it's possible. I think it's even plausible that Aaron Rodgers could be the better quarterback in 2023. But when we're talking about longevity, when we're talking about price, to me, Carr seems like the better fit. And it's not that I love Derek Carr, it's that of the options which are very flawed, I think Carr's the best one. And this goes back to the tough spot the Jets are in just by Zach Wilson failing. This is all a consequence of Zach Wilson being a bust. I'd like to be nicer, but if we're going to be honest, Zach Wilson's a bust. So the Jets essentially had their next couple of years planned around the idea of Zach Wilson would be there. He'd be the quarterback. They had the position filled. They were not going to have to spend a lot of money because Zach Wilson's on his rookie deal. They did not have to budget much for Zach Wilson. Now they're in a spot where they're going to have to try and find an expensive quarterback. And the guys who are available, anybody who's really that good usually isn't an option because their team doesn't let them go. So now you got to deal with guys who are flawed. Guys like Carr, who has always been good but not great through his career. Or somebody like Rodgers, who has been behaving erratically off the field and is approaching 40 and, frankly, has shown signs of decline, especially last year. That's the spot the Jets are in. So I don't look at this as like the Carr is like this supreme option, that he's the end-all option. I just think for what the Jets have, unless we're going to drop down to that next tier and you're going to get guys like Tannehill or Garoppolo or Brissett who really don't bring a whole lot, who maybe give you a certain floor, but just, you're not really going anywhere unless you put a great team around them. I think that you look at this situation, to me, Carr seems like the logical choice. I would not wait if I were the Jets, but to be honest with you, I'm not sure how interested I'd be in Rodgers anyway because of all the factors I mentioned, contract, age, performance, longevity. There's just a lot of issues I see with Rodgers. So, and this is the discussion. The discussion is now, do the Jets wait for Aaron Rodgers or do they make the move now with Carr? For me, the choice is rather simple. I think Derek Carr is the right option. And, it's not that I love Derek Carr. It's just, I'm not picking among options that are perfect. I'm picking among a series of flawed options. To me, Carr is the right move. I think the Jets should make a move to get Carr. I think they should be aggressive. I would not like to see them wait because we both know that there's a real chance that the Jets, wait around on Derek Carr. He signed somewhere else, and that leaves all your eggs in the Aaron Rodgers basket, and that's not a spot you want to be based on any number of factors. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some other developments from the weekend. Kind of flew under the radar, but it looks like the Jets are going to be keeping their special teams coach. Was there a chance they could lose him? Well, if you were paying attention over the last couple of weeks, you knew that there was some buzz out there that Brant Boyer might be moving on. Doesn't look like he will be anymore, though. We'll talk about it more as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and calories? Then you have to try Built Bars. We're past the holidays now. Hopefully you're keeping your New Year's resolution. One of mine was to eat healthier this year. If you're in that mindset, you got to try Built, because with Built, healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious that you won't think that they're good for you. What makes them so good? Well, for starters, they're all covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And I don't know how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And what's even better is that they're healthy. Most bars are only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait for your box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built bars just at Built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. So head to your nearest Walmart today, walk into the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with one of their hit flavors, brownie batter or churro. You can thank me later. Now, I don't think the Jets can entice Derek Carr by giving him some Built bars. There are rules against that in the salary cap, circumventing the cap. But I'm sure Derek Carr would love some Built bars if he comes to New York. Built Bar. They're absolutely delicious. You got to try them. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. With the Derek Carr visit in the news, something kind of flew under the radar this weekend, and that's that the Jets are probably going to be keeping their special teams coach, Brant Boyer. Were the Jets in danger of losing Brant Boyer? Well, there were some rumors out there that he may be looking to go to Arizona. Jonathan Gannon was just hired there as the head coach, and there was talk that maybe Boyer would be heading to the Cardinals as their special teams coach. However, a report broke just yesterday that the Cardinals are retaining their current special teams coach, Jeff Rodgers. Boyer's become a pretty popular figure in the Jets fan base. I think people would have been disappointed to lose him. He was hired back in 2016 under Todd Bowles, and you may remember that in 2015, the Jets had a disastrous year on special teams. Under Bobby April, who a guy who's been a very successful special teams coach in the league, a guy who was really just thought very highly of for years, and rightly so. He managed some exceptional special teams units. However, for whatever reason, it just did not work for the Jets in 2015. Everybody remembers that the Jets missed the playoffs by a game in 2015. People forget. I mean, the special teams were one of the biggest reasons they missed the playoffs. Everybody remembers that game in Buffalo. Well, they had a couple special teams errors that Week 17 game in Buffalo in 2015. But the special teams were just dreadful all season long for the Jets that year. And missing the playoffs by one game, I think you could put special teams that year near the top of the list as to reasons why. So Bobby April was let go after the 15 season. In came Brant Boyer, who had previously worked with the Colts as an assistant special teams coach. He got off to kind of an uneven start, and then 2018 was his big breakout year. The Jets had a couple of all-pros in kicker Jason Myers and return guy Andre Roberts. And for the most part, there were some exceptions. In 2020, the Jets had kind of a bad special teams year. This year, they were a bit up and down. Punting, in particular, was an issue. But for the most part, the Jets have had successful special teams units under Brant Boyer. And here's the other thing you know about Brant Boyer. He has survived 2 coaching changes. He survived a general manager change. That's a sign that the Jets really respect him. And it's a sign the Jets really like him. It's a sign, and the other thing I'll point out is that 2020, as I mentioned, was maybe his worst year. After his worst year, he survived a coaching change, which probably indicates the Jets really believe Boyer's a good coach and that the issues that year were more personnel related. How much impact does a special teams coach have? Well, my view on most coaches is that they don't really make that big of a difference. I think one of the few exceptions is Mike Westhoff, who was just the legendary special teams coach the Jets had under, I think it was 4 different head coaches. Mike Westhoff was a phenomenal special teams coach for the Jets. He just signed on with the Denver Broncos. He worked with Sean Payton for a year in New Orleans, so the Payton connection brought Westhoff to Denver. But if we take Westhoff out of the mix, because Westhoff's an absolute legend. If there was a Hall of Fame for assistant coaches, Mike Westhoff would be there. I think Boyer's an above average special teams coach. I think I've seen enough success from Jets special teams units through the years to suggest he's an asset to have. That you like having him around. He does a decent job picking players in the coverage units. Jets always seem like they find some guy who stands out in the special teams game. And I think that maybe the one issue with Boyer has been the kicking. After Jason Myers left in free agency, the Jets brought in a number of big-legged kickers who really could not kick straight. So you do wonder a bit about whether maybe Boyer was a little bit too confident in himself that he thought if he brought in somebody with a big leg, he could make it work. Finally, this year, the Jets decided to bring in a big leg guy in Greg Zuerlein, who actually has a successful track record in the NFL, and that worked so much better. But generally speaking, if you look, and these are difficult to judge, but there are some data points we can look to. Generally, in the Boyer era, the Jets have had above-average special teams. It's good to have them around. And special teams, I've always been a big special teams guy. I think special teams flies under the radar. People forget that around 20% of the snaps in the NFL, or plays in the NFL, because you have your kickoffs as well, but around 20% of the plays in the NFL are special teams. And they make a big difference. They can, sometimes if you set yourself up in good field position, or you set the opponent up in bad field position, it makes it much more difficult to execute. I mean, is it easier to go 50, 60 yards, or is it easier to go 90 yards? It's one of those things, those hidden yards that, maybe don't put points on the board, maybe don't take points off the board, but make a huge difference in the ultimate outcome of the game. And it's an area where Boyer has done very well. And the other thing with special teams coaches is that they're primarily dealing with backup level players. It's tough because you usually don't put your starters on special teams. Typically what you do is you put backup guys, you put third stringers, you put guys who otherwise wouldn't be on the field. And in preseason, I talk about this a lot, how a guy can earn a spot on special teams because the number 6 wide receiver is usually not going to see the field on offense, but he'll have an opportunity to see the field if he performs well on special teams. So a lot of it is about spotting talents. It's not obvious like it is for a game-breaking receiver. I think a lot of the special teams coach's job is just spotting guys who can succeed. It's obvious to spot a shutdown corner. Anybody can tell you who a great defensive back's going to be, like a Sauce Gardner. I mean, you or I could have told you Sauce Gardner is going to be a great corner. The special teams coach has to find guys who are maybe a little bit less talented, but have specific skill sets that can make it work. And I think, generally speaking, and it's not been perfect, I'm not going to put Boyer on Westhoff's level, but Boyer's done a pretty decent job, and I think there's been more good than bad. I think it's a positive for the Jets that it sounds like he'll be sticking around. Now, who knows? Maybe some other job will open up, but the Arizona job was the one that's been rumored, and it's because they are keeping their current guy. It sounds like Brant Boyer is going to be staying with the Jets. I think a positive thing for this franchise moving forward. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll close out this Tuesday episode. I've got an interesting mock draft for you. It's one that kind of goes in an unconventional place for the Jets in the first round. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about why it might not be such a bad idea as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. We're talking off-season, which means the NFL season's over, but we are only at the midway point of the NBA season, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers to threes drained. I mean, you can talk about anything. You can do player points, you can do rebounds, assists, and there are exclusive bets. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at an even bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. I have an interesting mock draft I wanted to share, and it was from my colleagues Matt Williamson and Brian Peacock over at the Peacock and Williamson podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And if you're a longtime listener, those two names you may remember because they've both been guests on the show to talk about various topics. Matt Williamson's a former NFL scout. He comes on periodically to talk about league-wide news. Brian Peacock, in addition to his work on the national show Peacock and Williamson, is also a 49ers expert. So when the Jets hired Robert Saleh, we had him on a couple times to break down what that meant for the team. This is an interesting draft because for the first time I've seen a mock that does not have the Jets drafting a tackle at 13. Instead, they take Brian Branch, a defensive back out of Alabama. And I know that this is going to raise a lot of eyebrows. And I think that largely the fan base is expecting one of two things with the 13th pick. Either they go with the mindset of pretty much everybody who's got a mock draft out there and they take a tackle, or the pick gets traded, and maybe it's traded for Aaron Rodgers, maybe it's sent to Green Bay, or maybe it's some other sort of move for a quarterback. I think that there would be a lot of resistance to the Jets doing something like this, especially if it's on the defensive side of the ball, because right now the defense is the dominant unit on the team. And the offense needs a lot of work, and especially the offensive line in particular needs a lot of work. But I think that you have to keep an open mind with this stuff. And I'm going to talk about this more as we approach the draft, but I think sometimes you get a little bit too focused on the specific position you play. And that can be a mistake. And all you have to do is go back 1 year. And it's funny because there's a lot of revisionist history about the Sauce Gardner pick. There were a lot of people. Everybody says now, it was an obvious pick. We needed to make this pick. Anybody would have done that. That's not really true. All you have to do is go back and look at some of the reactions to that pick in the fan base. Now, I think I'm not saying the pick was unpopular in the fan base, but it was nowhere near unanimous that was the right pick for the Jets. In fact, even heading into training camp, I heard a number of people suggest that the Jets should have drafted an offensive lineman like an Evan Neal. And one of the issues was that, corner at the time did not seem like a great weakness. The Jets had Bryce Hall coming back, and even though Bryce Hall had a really rough season, didn't even play that much, in part because the Jets drafted Sauce. This time last year, he was viewed as a quality starter. The Jets had already brought in DJ Reed in free agency. They had Brandon Eccles as a potential developmental player at the corner position. It just did not, at least to some people, it did not seem like it was that big of a need. And then Mekhi Becton goes down in training camp and said, well, why didn't we draft a tackle? We were already set at corner. You saw what happened. Sauce went on to be Defensive Rookie of the Year. He changed the defense. It's a point that I make frequently, and I'm going to keep making it because I think it needs to get through. There are two ways to improve your football team. One is absolutely improving a weakness. And I think it's fair to say that sometimes, I think it's fair to say that in an ideal world, your biggest need will line up with the best player available. But getting the best player, I think, is more important because you need impact in the NFL to win. And it matters less what position it comes in. I think you just got to get great players. And just a spot where you're okay. If your team is just full of guys who are just okay, you're not going to win. I'd rather have one great player and one weak player than two guys who are just okay. Because great players change the game. They force the other team to adapt. They make game-changing plays. I'd rather have great players. And I don't focus as much. Again, in an ideal world, the best player for the Jets would be at the tackle position. But sometimes it's just not where the talent is. And I'll give you an example. I'm not saying Evan Neal's career is over, but was Evan Neal as good as Sauce Gardner last year? Would the Jets have been a better team with Evan Neal there, even though on paper maybe tackle was a bigger need at the time? The answer is no, because Sauce Gardner is a great player. Sauce Gardner changed this defense this past season. It's not all about position. I can't say position's irrelevant, because I think at some point you do need to address certain spots, especially premium spots on the field like tackle. But I think sometimes we make it a little bit too simplistic. All positions are not necessarily created equal in the NFL, but great players are great players. So you have to find the right balance. It's not so. I think sometimes we just get a little bit too focused. Maybe there's a little bit too much tunnel vision, and we state these theories and we take them to these extremes. Like, you have to draft a player at this position. Well, sometimes the player you draft at that position isn't any good. Sometimes he's a bust. And you have to be flexible. You have to be able to determine who's going to be the right player for your team. And sometimes it's in an unconventional spot. Again, I think if the Jets draft a player on defense, it's going to be a very unpopular pick. I think people will wonder why the Jets are not addressing the offense. But if he's a great player, people will love him in a year. It's funny. 5 years down the line, nobody ever remembers what your needs were. Do you remember what the Jets' needs were 5 years ago? Do you remember what their needs were 4 years ago? Probably not. When you look back at those drafts, you only remember whether a guy was good for the Jets or not. You only remember whether the guy lived up to his promise. You don't remember whether or not he filled the specific need at that point in time. And that's because needs change from year to year. What drafting well does is it prevents you from having a need. When you draft a star player, that means that position is not going to be a need for 10 years. You may need a corner this year. You may need a linebacker next year. Who knows what's going to happen? Drafting for me, and by the way, when you draft players, they usually don't contribute that much year one. When you get a Sauce Gardner or Garrett Wilson, you should be happy with it, but the expectation is usually not, especially once we get past the first round, that you're going to find guys who are going to be able to contribute on day one. So you're really drafting for the future. You're drafting for guys who can be 10-year players for you. You're not necessarily just drafting for right now. And I think that's something that's important to consider. Most mock drafts right now have tackle for the Jets. It could make sense for them. I'm just saying, sometimes you got to keep an open mind when we're talking about positions. And that mock draft was a reminder, so that's why I wanted to bring it up. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.